Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. Great to have you in the conversation today, talking about defeating Darwin in 4 easy steps. Defeating Darwin in 4 easy steps. Now, I began talking about this in the last segment. I want to review that so we get a nice little tight package with this template delivered to you in video form that you can share with others. But remember, the first thing I said, look, if evolution was true, there'd be no way to know it. Because according to evolution, everything's the product of the random collision of atoms, including the thoughts that we think about evolution. There's no reason to think that any of those thoughts are true. It's like trying to identify the correct Rorschach ink blot. There is no correct or true Rorschach ink blot. They just exist because they are the product of completely random processes. Now, the first step, defeating Darwin in 4 easy steps. Here's the template. Let's review it again. First law, second law, fossils, and genes. It kind of rolls trippingly off the tongue. That's your template, 4-step template. First law, second law, fossils, and genes. Repeat after me. First law, second law, fossils, and genes. Again, if you've got this template in your brain, then you're prepared to have a discussion with anybody on the issue of origins, not just from a biblical standpoint, but also from a scientific standpoint. Now, first law, remember, just reviewing quickly, first law of thermodynamics says that matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. In other words, there's no observable process in the universe. Scientists have concluded as a scientific law that there is no process inside the universe that can explain the origin of energy or matter. But here it is. We're surrounded by energy and matter. So logically, somebody outside the universe had to put it there. I mean, logically, there's simply no other conclusion that you can draw. The God of the Bible is Aristotle's prime mover, the unmoved mover. Now, first law, second law, fossils and genes. What do I mean by the second law of thermodynamics? This is called the law of entropy. And again, notice it's a law. It's not a theory. Like evolution is a theory. This is a law, the second law of thermodynamics. And what it teaches us is that the universe is headed toward a heat death. That's because every time there's a heat reaction, every time there's a chemical reaction, every time something happens in the universe, there's a loss of energy. I mean, it's infinitesimal, but there's a loss of energy in every chemical reaction, every heat reaction, and that energy is never again available for another heat reaction. It's permanently lost in terms of its utility. That's why eventually we're just going to run out of heat and we're going to be dead and cold. Now, this is why things break down when they're left to themselves. This is why scientists tell us we're headed for the universe is headed for a heat death. So what this law teaches us then, this is a scientific law, it teaches us that the universe, and that would include life, everything in the universe, is headed toward increasing randomness and decay. Now, what does the theory of evolution teach us? It says exactly the opposite. Remember, it's a theory, so the law says everything is winding down, everything is decaying, everything is deteriorating, everything is headed toward increasing chaos, everything is headed toward increasing randomness. What does the theory, and I emphasize the word theory, of evolution teach us? It teaches us that the universe and life is headed toward increasing complexity and order. Things are getting more complex. They're getting more orderly all the time. That's the evolutionary process. Now, you put your scientific theory that things are headed toward increasing complexity and order up against the scientific law that everything's headed toward randomness and decay. I'm going to go for the scientific law every single time. Now, this also tells us, by the way, that the universe had a beginning. Realize how important that is. Either the universe has always existed or it has not. But this law, the fact that the universe is winding down, what does that tell you? And that's a law. What does that tell you? Somebody wound it up. It hasn't always existed. Matter is not eternal. Somebody made this watch and somebody wound up the watch and it started to tick down. So what we've got with creationism is we have a watchmaker and we have a watch winder. Somebody that made the watch, somebody that wound it up at the very beginning. Evolution does not. First law, second law, fossils and genes. And what do I mean when I refer to the fossil record? Now remember, this is important to understand. The fossil record is the only tangible physical evidence for the theory of evolution that exists. I repeat, do not miss this. This is the only evidence they have. This is the only physical, tangible thing they can show you that provides any sort of evidence for the theory of evolution. The fossil record is it. They got nothing else. There's nothing else that Darwinians have that they can show you. But listen to what, and this is what Yale University's Carl Dunbar says. Again, this is Yale University, not a conservative guy. Fossils provide the only historical documentary evidence that life has evolved from simpler to more and more complex forms. That's it, fossil record. Yale University guy says that. So if Darwin's theory is correct, that increasingly complex life forms developed in tiny little incremental and transitional steps, then the fossil record should be littered with an enormous number of transitional fossils. You know, last night Bill Nye thought he'd identified one, something called a top minnow, and he was ecstatic. He was beside himself. Now, it's not a transitional form. It's not a missing link, but he believed it is. So he was all excited. He'd found one in the entire universe that he managed to find. Well, you need millions and millions and millions of these transitional forms. Darwin himself said, quote, the number of intermediate and transitional links must have been inconceivably great. But what does the fossil record show instead? We ought to have the fossil record just littered with all of these intermediate forms, all of these transitional forms, something showing life progressing from one species to another. We do not. Now, Darwin thought, now he was aware of all these gaps in the fossil record in his day. And he thought, well, that's going to be cleared up. We're going to do more digging, and we're going to come up with more transitional fossils. 150 years later, they have fewer transitional fossils than they did at the beginning. They're losing them because they identify some of these fossils as a transitional form, and then scientists come to the conclusion, no, that's really not. That was an independent life form, not part of the chain whatsoever. So they're losing these transitional forms virtually by the day. Now, this is Stephen Jay Gould. He was the leading paleontologist in the world up to the time of his death. And here's what he said. This Harvard guy. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. Now, when Stephen Jay Gould uses the phrase extreme rarity, that's Harvard speak for nada, zilch, zippo, none, no transitional forms. And what Stephen Jay Gould says, this is the trade secret of paleontology. In other words, we know that there are no transitional fossils. You don't, and we don't want you to find out because it will blow the entire theory of evolution right out of the tub. Colin Patterson, British Museum of Natural History, quote, there are no transitional fossils, no, none, nada, not one, for which one could make a watertight argument. That's the British Museum of Natural History curator, not one transitional fossil, period. So the people that study fossils for a living, they know that there are no transitional forms, but they don't want you and me to know about that because we might stop imbibing and believing the swill of evolution. Now, Gould developed an absolutely absurd theory. This is completely, totally, utterly absurd. It's called the theory of punctuated equilibrium. Now, Gould says, look, there's no transitional forms. So here's my explanation. Evolution happened so fast in such rapid bursts that it left no trace in the fossil record. So I want you to think about that for a second. The only evidence that he has for his theory is the total absence of any evidence whatsoever. And this guy taught at Harvard and was considered the leading paleontologist in the world. Happened so fast, we have no idea what the mechanism was. We have no evidence that it happened that fast. We're just believing it did, and that's why there is no evidence that life developed in these rapid bursts. So what the fossil record teaches us then is that increasingly complex life forms appear fully formed in the fossil record, just as if they were put there by a creator. Now, you've got this thing called the Pre Cambrian Explosion. I talked with Stephen Meyer from the Discovery Institute about this. This is a vast, overwhelming, sudden appearance of complex life forms in the fossil record. Evolutionists have no explanation for it. All of a sudden, you have this explosion. They call it an explosion. Layers of the fossil record of rock replete with all these fully formed advanced life forms. So the Bible has an answer. These things, these increasingly complex life forms came fully formed from the hand of God. So the fossil record confirms the biblical account, and it is fatal for the theory of evolution. Now, last one, first law, second law, fossils, and genes. What do we know from genetics? Now, realize some evolutionists say, well, the second law only applies in a closed system, and the Earth is an open system, open to energy from the sun. Well, the universe is a closed system. It's not an open system. Carl Sagan, remember, he kept saying the cosmos, that's all there is, all there ever was, all there ever will be. This is it, closed system. So according to Carl Sagan, it's a closed system. But evolution will say, well, no, the Earth is not closed. It gets energy from the sun. Fine. You still, even if we give you that, you still have to have some mechanism to convert that energy into life. You got to have a mechanism. It's no good just to have the energy coming into the planet. It's like having a fast-flowing river. Well, you can't generate any hydroelectric energy from that unless you put a dam in and some kind of turbine. You got to have some way to translate that energy, to capture that energy and turn it into electricity. Just the energy itself doesn't do you any good unless you've got some kind of mechanism to convert it into something useful. Well, what is the mechanism in evolution? It is genetic mutation. That's all they've got, because that's the only mechanism they have that would explain actual changes in the DNA of a living organism, because those are the changes that are passed on. The changes in the DNA can be inherited, but acquired characteristic, I mean, if you bulk up, you lift weights and you bulk up, and then you get married and have a kid, your kid is not going to be bulked up just because you are. That's an acquired characteristic. Now, the problem here, I don't have time to develop this at length. Maybe I'll mention a quote or two after the break. But here is the problem with genetic mutations, which, remember, is all they've got. That is the only mechanism that evolutionists have to take that energy that comes from the sun or wherever and turn it into increasingly complex life forms. Genetic mutations are invariably harmful, if not fatal, to the organism. They do not improve an organism's capacity to survive. They invariably weaken it. That's why one of the common terms for genetic mutations in our parlance is birth defects. Now let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that we're able to engineer some kind of genetic advance in the lab. Prove our point, it takes intelligence and design. Doesn't happen by chance. Back in 2.